by a bent line, by a straight line, by a crooked line. The Crooked Path, a podcast for modern cunning folk with Peter Pagan.
Hello and welcome to The Crooked Path. My name is Peter Pagan, and today we're going to take a look at the dreaded Hex Star. But first, a wee bit of news. So, for those of you that may have missed us over the Memorial Day weekend, we will be vending at Melrose Trading Post on Saturday. For those of you who haven't been there before, it's in Woodland Hills, Southern California, sort of northern end of the LA area, and it is at Ventura Boulevard and Winnetka at the Taft Charter High School. And we'll be there. I think they open at 9 o'clock and they're open until 3 p.m. and we will be selling our glassy wares and Ravenslight incense and all kinds of other good stuff. For those of you who are a little further afield, you can also find us in 2 stores online now. The Etsy store, where I sell my glassware, is at www.etsy.com/shop/Pendraig, same name as the publishing company. And when Linda has built up her stock of some pottery, her Etsy store will be updated, and I'll give you a link to that then. But for right now, she's frantically trying to make new stuff. I'm also selling specifically pagan items at eclecticartisans.com website, which is at www.eartisans.net, and you can find my stuff specifically if you go to eartisans.net/collections/Peter-Patterns-crooked-art, or if you just look in the chalices section, I make all the sexy etched glass chalices. And some of my books are there. I'll be adding more books to it as well. Obviously not in the chalice section, it's in the book section. And you'll notice I'm wearing a stunning t-shirt with my Covens emblem on it. This was designed by my producer, Christopher, try that again in British. Christopher, who is controlling the image that you see before you. He in fact does control the horizontal and the vertical, and some strange diagonal directions as well, but we won't go into that right now. It's a family show, at least at the moment it is. But anyway, he did the basic design based on my requests, and this was hand silk screened by myself and Rob, a member of the Coven. So I can quite honestly say this was handmade by Roberts. Well, a Robert. It's an old joke. It's a sketch from a British TV show. It was a joke about Volkswagen, I think it was, had ads in the 70s showing their brand new automated production line, and they were declared that their cars were hand built by robots. And so they did this sketch where it's a bunch of guys in overalls. So, hey Bob, can you pass me the spanner? And everyone on the production line is called Bob, but they're all doing it by hand working on the cars. And the catch line at the end was hand built by Roberts. Obviously, having to explain it was a really bad joke, but I had to go there. And at least Rob will be chuckling to himself when he hears this, even if no one else is. Everyone else is groaning. Rob is chuckling, and I am feeling slightly embarrassed. But that's nothing unusual. Every time I open my mouth, really, that something embarrassing comes out. But anyway, that's it for the news this week. It's not very exciting. Oh, except I almost forgot that I have a new blog entry out at my Podbean blog, which you'll also find if you go to my author page on Amazon. It's linked there, about my adventures on Sunday, where I went to WeirdCon and got to sit on a panel with Angela Hunt from Hunt Press and Robert Suter, who's also known as True Thomas, and we talked about the future of e-publishing, and that was a lot of fun. And then I got to meet Jim Butcher, and as I've just this afternoon finished reading the his latest Dresden Files novel, which arrived last night on my Kindle. That was really exciting because he's one of my favourite authors, and so I geeked out a little bit, I have to be honest. But it was really cool. I had a good time, and if you're interested in what we have to say about e-publishing, my blog has a link to a video of the panel and also an audio recording, because the video recording, the video camera battery died about an hour in, and the panel went for 2 hours, so luckily I was doing a backup audio recording as well, so the whole thing is on audio, but the first hour is also available on video, so you can watch my ugly mug contorting as I try and sound like a civilized human being. But anyway, that's it, that's the news, so let's get on with the show, shall we? Now, a lot of people associate the pentagram or the pentacle with witchcraft. Also the triple goddess sign, which is usually the 3 phases of the moon, 2 crescent moons back to back with a full moon between them. But one of the oldest symbols for witchcraft, it dates back to Anglo-Saxon times, is the Hex Star. And the Hex Star is a very basic symbol. It's 3 straight lines, 1 vertical and 2 diagonals, creating a 6-rayed star. And this is known as the Hex Star, because witchcraft used to be known as Hexencraft, or just die Hexe, and that's where our modern term hex comes from, in case you hadn't guessed by this point. And as I said, it's one of the oldest symbols of witchcraft. Some people consider it to be the witch's mark, other people consider other things to be the witch's mark, and where I fall as it is where I normally fall in these instances, somewhere between the two. So I'm going to be very enigmatic there, because in my tradition the witch's mark is something that we don't share outside of the initiates. So I'm not going to tell you what I consider to be the witch's mark, but traditionally the Hex Star is one of the options. And it is an interesting thing. It's, as I said, it's basically 3 lines crossing at the centre, and one of the old witchy ways of describing it is where 3 roads meet and 3 roads part. And this is often seen as a description of a crossroads where 3 paths cross. But there is a little more to it than that. In fact, the true witch's crossroads, the crossroads that you should meet the man in black at midnight, or the witching hour, is actually where 3 paths cross, but it's 2 roads and a gallows. And that actually gives you a little clue as to what the Hex Star really is, because the Hex Star is a flat 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional symbol. And it's basically 2 ley lines crossing and the world tree creating the 3rd path, or in the old classic sense, the gallows, because gallows were seen as very magical places where somebody was violently done to death but justice was served, in theory. And so it is very much a threshold place, and it was not any old crossroads that you went to meet with the devil or the man in black, or to do your witchy work. It was usually the crossroads outside the village where the gallows was, where the criminals were hung, which is also convenient because there may be a few ingredients you need to pick up at the same time, like a hand of glory, which is the hand of a corpse, usually a murderer or some other executed criminal. Very pragmatic our witchy ancestors were, and so a lot of the symbolism here is very interesting. A lot of people always think of the Hex Star as being a flat symbol and being like a primitive Star of David, because it's a 6-rayed star, and the classic Star of David is also a 6-pointed star, and so oh yes, it's very, very, very similar symbology. Anyone who uses the word symbology, I'd switch off straight away. I hate the word. It's symbolism. Symbology is the study of symbols. Symbolism is where you're talking about what a symbol means. Peter the word Nazi strikes again. But there you go. Just don't get me started on pentacles and pentacles. I start sounding like Daddy K if we go down that path, and that is not at all pretty. But there are other things that the Hex Star represent, and interestingly enough, they mostly are three-dimensional things. So this little flat 3 lines crisscrossing on a piece of paper represents a whole bunch of three-dimensional things, and one of my favourites is it represents the tripod upon which hangs the cauldron of the art. And traditionally the tripod that you hang the cauldron over the fire with is composed of 3 sacred woods, oak and ash and thorn. And even Rudyard Kipling wrote about them. He wrote a beautiful poem that got turned into a folk song of all the trees that grow so tall, old England to adorn, there is none that can compare with oak and ash and thorn. So, any excuse to witter and warbled at you. But there's some very interesting lore associated with the oak and ash and thorn that specifically applies to the Hex Star. The really interesting thing is that when you look at if you look at a wooden tripod, the modern metal tripods tend to be hinged or connected at the top with a pin, or they interlock with each other in some way, and so you get a tripod that is sort of tetrahedral. It's 3 legs coming up to a point where they all come joined together, and that's it. But the old tripods made of wood, they used to be bound at the top, and so you would have a bit of the stick forming an inverted tripod above the binding. And this is where the Hex Star comes in, because the Hex Star is obviously this older kind of tripod where you have the 3 legs below and the 3 extensions above. And in this configuration, it actually represents something else very interesting. The world tree or billy tree. You have the fire and the cauldron, which represents the mound and the interior sun below, and traditionally you would have a nest in which the zoo bird sat at the top. And the zoo bird is a Mesopotamian terminology. Often a drake or a serpent is seen in classical witchcraft literature as residing in the branches of the world tree, or in the nest atop the tripod. And the really interesting thing is when you examine the wood of the tripod, because the tripod or the Hex Star in 3 dimensions in that configuration is basically a double awen. Awen is the symbol of enlightenment that the modern druids use, the 3 rays, and basically they're often ascribed to oak and ash and thorn, as we already mentioned, being the 3 sacred woods. They are the first Cobran letters from which all the others are derived, and they contain an awful lot of very interesting mysteries. And one of the mysteries is that the other half of the tripod, the other half of the Hex Star, is a second awen that points upwards, because the emanation doesn't just come down from above, it comes up from below. In some ways you might almost be more accurate describing the double awen as being like that, which interestingly looks very much like the mitochondria in a cell during cell division or mitosis. So there's some interesting mysteries there about creation as well. But when you have them in the sort of more classic configuration, emanating from a central point to form the Hex Star, there is a mystery concealed in the woods that we talk about, oak and ash and thorn. The lower awen, or the awen that everybody knows about, is composed of oak and ash and thorn, but the 3 staves that combine the upward pointing awen become very interesting because the woods are transformed. The oak gets transformed into the bloody oak, which is an Old English name for holly, and the ash gets transformed into the rowan, also known as the mountain ash, and the thorn, which is traditionally the hawthorn or white thorn, gets transformed into the black thorn. So you get this very interesting transmutation between the 2 awens, and the traditional magical properties of the trees are very significant here. For example, hawthorn is often used as a tree for gaining access to the fairy realms, and it's also used in healing. And in fact, hawthorn is very good for blood pressure. You can actually buy these little wafers in Chinese supermarkets that will help keep your blood pressure down if you chew them regularly, and they're actually fairly decent tasting as well. And you can also get hawthorn capsules in health food stores for the same reason, because it helps you with blood pressure. Blackthorn, of course, is for cursing. It's the blasting rod, it's the cursing rod. And so you have this interesting flip. The properties and uses magically of the trees is very significant to this. I'm not going to go into any detail on that right now, because it's something you want to play with for yourself and come to your own realizations of. Because I like people to take ownership of stuff, and if I just blast off a whole bunch of correlations, you'll just take my word for it and go whittering on happily on your way. But if you go and look it up and ponder it for yourself, it becomes yours, not mine. And instead of being something I gave you, it's something you have earned for yourself. And it's a very important mystery. See, even my categories. And the double Allen has all kinds of implications with the Colburn as well, and we'll save that for another workshop, well, at some point I will actually finally get around to writing my book on the Goulburn and then doing a workshop and a podcast on the Goulburn as well, but it'll have to wait for that. But one of my favourite images is if you take the two ley lines with the billy tree as the three-dimensional representation of the Hex Star, you actually get some very important symbolism. Because first of all, this is the epitome of sacred space. For the Wiccans, circle space. For those of us who are trad crafters who try and avoid the use word casting circle because it's copyright the Wiccan. Well, it isn't really copyright the Wiccans, but we have this innate habit of trying to show how different we are from the Wiccans, and so we don't call it casting circle. They are very similar, not quite the same, but they are very similar in form and function. But what you have is basically the compass directions, north, south, east and west, the ley lines between them, with the billy tree rising at the centre. And when you look at this from above, you get a very important witchcraft symbol, the circle cross, or the equal arm cross. Cross inside a circle, which is known as the mark of Cain. And the mark of Cain is very interesting because it is one of the classical symbols that people think may be the original witch mark. It isn't, but it is actually connected to it. And all I will say on that subject is that there is a very simple saying, one that should be very familiar to long-time fans of this podcast, because it's you hear it in the opening titles every time you listen to one of my podcasts, by a bent line, by a straight line, by a crooked line. And if you take that into account when drawing your circle cross, you will find that you come up with a symbol that is related to the Hex Star and the circle cross, and is very, very witchy. And that's all I'm saying on that one, so there. So, let's talk some practicalities, shall we? Now, we were talking about the tripod and its relationship to the billy tree. And working with the billy tree can be a fairly abstract thing, because we can haul the stang into the centre of the ritual space and have it represent the billy tree. But it is it already has several functions before you do that, and whilst it is a good functional representation, there are interesting options that you can use instead for practical crafting. And one of the options is to create the tripod in the centre of the ritual space. And you can do this using the traditional sacred woods of oak, ash and thorn, or you can get really strange and crafty. I mean, in my coven we actually use 3 oak staves to do this. One red oak, white oak and black oak. 3 different varieties of oak, and we have a great deal of success with them. It brings in some other elements of the Initiate Mysteries, but when you have the tripod there, it gives you some interesting options for practical crafting, because you can now hang things on the tripod or from the tripod. You can literally work with a cauldron hanging beneath it, over a fire, even if you're outdoors. I don't recommend setting a fire in your indoor temple unless you have it designed to deal with that kind of setup. But you can. There's also a lot of very interesting crafting. We tend to use the tripod instead of a maypole, because when you have the chase that leads up to the sacred marriage, the May King and the May Queen, it's a lot easier to do the transition from chase to hieros when the May Queen is draped tastefully over a tripod. I'll leave you to paint the pictures. It can get quite raunchy, which is exactly how it should be at Beltane, just in case you were wondering. But the tripod makes for some very interesting crafting, and you can also take the separate sticks from the tripod and use them in different ways. Various traditions will assign various meanings to the sticks in the tripod. It may represent drakes. I mean, we use the red, white and black oak, and so obviously there's a connotation of dragons there, with the red and white dragon that you find in the Legend of Merlin, that were battling under the castle that Vortigern was trying to build, and lots of other different things that you can work with there. It's a very versatile way of working, and we love it personally, or I love it personally, and everyone else has to put up with what I want because I'm the Magister, the Madge with the badge. But it does lend itself to some very interesting crafting. We've mentioned several times about the ley lines. Ley lines can be the old straight tracks, the dragon trails that you find in the landscape, but they can also be the lines of force and energy between the compass points within your working compass, your ritual space. And the most obvious ones are the ones going from east to west and south to north, but you also have ley lines at the cross quarters, and you can also have other ley lines. For example, I should have thought to throw up a diagram of this for you, but the old craft pentagram, which has one of the points outside the circle to the northeast, is basically the north-south and east-west ley lines, and some diagonals that go off to the point in the northeast, and lines that join the north and the east. Those ley lines can all be worked by walking or crafting in some way, whether you walk the paths, or whether you can swing stuff. You do a pendulum working or a sensor working, which can be an interesting, very high church way of doing old school crafting. And there's a lot of opportunities. You can also, if you work with, if the tradition you work uses a magical alphabet that's spaced out around the compass or the wheel of the ear, you know, whether it's the Ogham or the Cobran or runes or whatever it is, whatever tradition you work, you can basically do great walk sigils in your working space as a way of pulling energy in or working with entities or empowering things. Lots of opportunities there. Ley line work is something that is something of a lost art, and maybe we should actually do a whole podcast just on ley line workings, because walking ley lines, walking the old straight tracks, walking the dragon trails is a very potent form of crafting that you don't see many people doing these days. So something to bear in mind if you want to, you know, win in the I use an obscure form of magic game. Yeah, it's right up there with the Nokian magic for obscure and I'm special. And you can craft with the Hex Star in a lot of different ways. If you think about it, it's the directions and heights and depths. And so you work with it whenever you create your sacred space, because you call the quarters in or call the earths. You call heights and depths in some form or other, whether you do it as heights and depths or whether you do it as calling in the Lord and Lady. You work with the Hex Star already a lot more than you may realise, and doing so consciously will only empower what you're doing. So it's really worth having a good think about the old Hex Star and seeing where it takes you. It's an interesting contemplation, an interesting meditation, and something really interesting to research, I think. So I hope that has whetted your appetite, given you some food for thought, and a whole bunch of other cliches that will have you running for the Google to seeing what obscure facts you can dig up. If you enjoyed this, then say hi on Facebook or something. If you didn't enjoy it, then pretend you did and say hi anyway, because I'm a terribly fragile soul, and I need your validation. So anyway, that's it for this week. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back again next week with another strange and exciting witchy topic. So thanks for listening.
By a bent line, by a straight line, by a crooked line. The Crooked Path, a podcast for modern cunning folk with Peter Pagan. By a bent line, by a straight line, by a crooked line. The Crooked Path, a podcast for modern cunning folk with Peter Pagan.